Next up, we have a presentation on clinical trials with Dr. Jordan Berlin from Vanderbilt University. He's also the Chief Medical Officer, or Scientific Officer of our Medical Advisory Board. So we're very glad to have you here with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. I come from just over yonder at Tennessee and got a chance to come here. I don't have a cool British accent, so I won't sound as smart. I won't even try. I do want Mary Margaret to recognize that I tried to get a periwinkle shirt. When they first announced that they chose the color periwinkle, I was at a meeting and I wanted to get a shirt that was periwinkle, so I went to the Macy's across the street and I said, I need a periwinkle shirt. They said, what's that? So I went over across the street again to the Walgreens and I bought the 48 box of Crayola crayons, which has periwinkle in it. And I brought it over to them. I said, this is the color I want. And I still didn't get one. But I tried. So I'm going to talk about clinical trials. Unlike William thought, I'm not going to talk about any specific data. Really, I'm going to talk about what clinical trials are, what they're about, why you might want to participate in them, and all the issues around clinical trials. Probably not everything because this is a short talk. And in the meantime, I'm going to show you gratuitous pictures of my dogs because that's the type of guy I am. So we'll start out with a gratuitous picture, and the question is, why clinical trials? And my dog does pee on his sister's head. So it's very disturbing, and I have special pads for cleaning her. So the first thing, of course, for clinical trials, you want to know what's in it for you. What's in it for the person who's got the cancer, who's going to be going on the clinical trial. And the first and foremost thing is, of course, new options. If we were curing everybody with stomach cancer, none of us would be here today. That's the truth. We would all be sitting out there and relaxing right now because we'd have won. But we're not. So we're going to keep looking until not only are we curing everybody, but we're doing it without making them real sick. Because if we come up with something that's a cure, we're going to want to find something that's better, that's going to make them less sick if we come up with a toxic cure. Hopefully we won't. When we open clinical trials, we, the physicians who are opening them, are always hoping that our new trial is offering something that's better than what's currently available for the specific situation, whether it's somebody who's had their cancer removed and we're trying to prevent the cancer from coming back, or whether it's the first treatment they're getting, or the second treatment they're getting, or the third treatment they're getting. We always want to come up with something better than the current situation they're in, and that's the goal of the clinical trial. At the same time, never underestimate the value of hope. Hope offers a lot to people, and the truth is that one of the hardest things for people is when there isn't hope. And the truth is clinical trials do offer hope. Now, you won't hear your doctor talk to you, go on this clinical trial because it's got hope, because we're not really allowed to do that, but it is a reality. And so here I'm allowed to say there's a reality, that there's some hope. There's also altruism. People actually, and I'm not recommending going on clinical trials because you're hoping to help other people, but the reality is that almost everybody I put on a clinical trial also thinks, I'm hoping I'll also help somebody else who's going through the same thing as I am. I don't want them to go through this like I did. Maybe they'll have something better because I went on this clinical trial. So what comes from clinical trials, the reality is that every drug, every treatment that we use for this disease has been used in a clinical trial to figure out its effectiveness. Most of the other speakers, actually all the other speakers before me, spoke about clinical trials, in terms of radiation and chemo. And to understand how we got to where we are, we need data to prove that we're actually helping people. And I use heart bypass as my greatest example of why do clinical trials. Before we did the heart bypass surgeries we currently do, they used to take the artery underneath the breastbone, called the lima, and they used to smack it into the middle of the ventricle, which is the main muscle of the heart. And they said it was helping people live longer and it was helping their hearts, and they insisted on it. Until finally somebody said, we should do a clinical trial. So they compared it to just giving medications. And it turns out that it wasn't any better than just giving medications. And after that, we developed a bypass surgery that does help people live longer. So clinical trials are crucial for knowing that we're really actually helping people. We also learn how drugs are broken down in the body, how effective the treatment is, in which diseases they're effective. We develop a lot of drugs that work in multiple diseases. And sometimes some of the drugs that we develop for cancer can work in other diseases that aren't even cancer. We learn the best way to give the drugs or give the good drugs with radiation and give just radiation. And we learn how to manage the side effects, which is an absolutely crucial part of what we do. And not a part that we talk about often enough in our lectures to each other. So now I'm going to go through a little bit of the issues. Well, of course, the biggest problem with doctors is synonyms. They should never have given us synonyms because we use different words. These aren't all exact synonyms on this slide, but we use different words to describe the same thing, and it confuses people. And I apologize, but we do that a lot. I'm going to try and give you some verbiage that we actually use routinely in this. So, some language. And Chance, actually, the dog there, doesn't actually know any language. He doesn't even understand English, near as I can tell. Doesn't follow any rules. So what is standard therapy? Well, so that's a key issue for us. What is our standard therapy? Standard therapy can be a lot of things, and actually Hope showed you that there are a lot of different drugs that can all be used, and they're all standard. Because there are a lot of things that are similarly active in several of the settings. But a treatment standard is something we give to patients not treated on clinical trials, although we can use the standard treatment as part of our therapy on a clinical trial. But obviously we want to use something experimental on the clinical trial. Clinical trial standard is different than a treatment standard sometimes, but generally it's the same. It should be the same. And what it is that's the arm that a clinical trial standard is what we need to beat to win. The two are usually the same, but I'm using the example of stomach cancer where there's a combination called cisplatin and 5-FU that we don't use a lot anymore, but it took us a long time to get the FDA to accept something other than cisplatin 5-FU, so it was often the standard even though we didn't like it much, okay? It's not that it didn't work, it worked. It's just we found slightly less toxic options, and we would prefer to use less toxic options. By the way, I put little pictures on because everybody told me that's nice to do. So how does a treatment become standard? Generally, it has to win. It has to beat something, usually in what we call a randomized trial. Something versus something else. And the one that wins becomes the standard, okay? We can compare against a placebo. We rarely do that. That's more of a blood pressure medicine type thing. We do have placebos on our trials. Usually that's standard care plus experimental drug versus standard care plus placebo. So everybody gets standard care. Some people get an extra drug, or standard care plus chemo plus radiation versus standard care alone, things like that. A comparison trial against the prior standard is the most common thing we do, which we take a new drug or new regimen and we compare it to the standard. If there's something really good, then we don't necessarily need to do what we call a randomized trial, and we just need a single-arm trial. And you'll see more of these things happening. More drugs are being approved because we're getting better drugs, and we're also finding unique things. I'm using an example of something called GI stromal tumor, which actually can happen in the stomach. And there was a drug called Gleevec that came out several years ago. Imatinib is the generic name. And there was nothing that even caused a 1% response rate in GIST. It was an absolutely deadly disease, nothing you could do if it had spread. And then imatinib came along, and about 70% of the patients had their tumor shrink. And it lasted for a long time. We didn't need to do a study against placebo, which was the only other option, to prove that that worked. So it got FDA approved without a randomized trial. The randomized trial was actually one dose of imatinib versus another dose of imatinib to see if one was better than the other. So sometimes you don't need that. The other thing you need to know, and again, this is still language, is not all drugs are chemotherapy, although in truth they are. So chemo really should refer to anything that's a chemical that we're giving to somebody, right? And in fact, actually, the number one journal for antibiotics is actually called chemotherapy, because they used to call antibiotics chemotherapy. But now chemotherapy really has used to a very narrow group of drugs which actually attack DNA, or the replication of DNA, or the duplication of cells. That's what chemotherapy is. We have other drugs that aren't chemo. We have hormone therapies in some diseases. We're not going to talk about those. but we have biologic or targeted agents. Some of the things you heard about earlier, the mutations, the Rho A, things like that, we're trying to target them. We're trying to block these things, okay? We're trying to block RAS. We're trying to block a lot of different proteins that come from mutated genes or amplified genes, as you heard with HER2. And so we're trying to block those things. And when we do that, that's called biologic agents. These proteins that come from these mutated genes are actually driving growth of cancer. Then there's immune therapy, which you're hearing about a lot because they have a lot of advertising dollars. And immune therapy is very exciting to us because it actually, when it does work, it can work really well. When it has side effects, it can have really bad side effects. But on average, it doesn't cause a lot of side effects, so we're very excited most of the time. But when it does have side effects, we get nervous. However, this is the newest therapy we have, and there are a lot of different things within each of these categories. A lot of different immune therapies, a lot of different targeted therapies, a lot of different chemotherapies. Finally, clinical trial versus study versus protocol. Again, synonyms, but not exactly. A clinical trial is always research, and a study is generally also always research too, but once in a while people will kind of fudge that one. Protocol is really the tricky one because a protocol is what is written to tell us how to follow the trial, how to behave on the trial, how to what tests to order, how often to give the drug, what doses to give, how to modify the drugs if you have side effects. But some people use protocols to define how they follow their routine care, standard care in their practices. So that's why protocol becomes tricky. Okay, other terms you're used to hearing, such as stage, phases of trials, I'll go over those, and adjuvant therapy, and that's what means when we cut out all disease, but we know there could be microscopic disease hiding behind, and we're trying to kill the microscopic disease that we can't see. Finally, I think this is the last one in the semantics, is lines of therapy. When you have advanced disease, it's not uncommon to get more than one treatment. The first treatment stops working, you go to a second treatment. And it's a simple thing is the first treatment is first line, second line is the second treatment. We generally start with our best foot forward. It doesn't make sense to not try the best thing first, right? So, and save the best for last doesn't make sense in cancer. So we start with the best thing. Doesn't mean the other things don't work, and sometimes what works best on average might not be what works best for an individual. So I've had patients who've had much better responses to their second treatment than to their first treatments because we can't predict everything for the individuals yet. We're working on that. Okay, so what are the kinds of clinical trials? This is my Great Dane, Layla. And you'll see more pictures of her because she holds still better. That's what Great Danes do is they sit still. Up at the top, there's a little diagram of the phases of clinical trials. It starts in the laboratory or preclinical, goes to phase 1, to phase 2, to phase 3, and then if it gets approved, there may be something called phase 4 trials. I'm not really going to talk about phase 4 trials. You don't see a lot of those anymore. Those are post-marketing trials, and they're not all that commonly done anymore because there's so many new drugs being developed, we don't have time to do the phase 4s, and they're not as important. I know that's confusing. So what are the trials? What do we need to know? Well, we need to know the right dose, the side effects of the drug, and we need to know, does the drug help, and how does it help, okay? So some drugs might help shrink tumors, and that may be really important, and some drugs might not shrink tumors, but might stop them from growing, and that can be equally as important because what we're really trying to do is keep people alive and well. Two things, alive, well, okay? So the first phase of trials is to find out what the right dose is to give. This is a phase 1 trial, okay? I hear people prejudiced against and for phase 1 trials. The reality is they are what they are. Phase 1 trials, the very true phase 1 trials, we're taking a drug that's in the laboratory only and giving it to the first humans ever. That's got risks, so don't be surprised that we don't treat 100 people at once because you can get surprises. Drugs that have no side effects in an animal can have tons, or vice versa. The reality is we start at a lower dose than was harmful to animals, for good reason. Okay, we can actually calculate out the dose equivalent for a mouse to a human because you don't give the same dose to a mouse and a human. You might not. But the bottom line is that we can calculate out that dose, and we start with a lower dose. We treat a few patients, And if they do really well, we'll go up a dose. And if they do really well, we'll go up a dose until we run into too many side effects. Or these days, if we run into, we're monitoring the blood and we're monitoring things, if we've got enough drug in the patients and we still don't have side effects, but we've got enough drug that we're hitting everything we need to do, we don't need to go higher. We don't need to cause excess side effects. In fact, if you look at the chemotherapy data now in breast cancer, they're starting to back down on the doses they were using because they found out lower doses are just as effective as the higher doses, and they don't make people as sick. That's actually a nice thing. So we're getting smarter. But we go up slowly, and we learn a lot about the side effects, but it's still only a few patients. So we have to go on to phase 2. Phase 2 gives us two things. One, we get a little more information about the side effects and how to manage them. And we also give one dose of the drug, so we're not changing the doses, to the same group of patients, all with the same disease. For example, newly diagnosed metastatic stomach cancer would be an example. We give them all the treatment, and we see how often it works, whether we're looking at response rate, the length of survival, the length of time before the tumors grow. Whatever we're looking for, that's what our endpoints are. We actually look at almost all the endpoints. And of course, if it looks potentially effective, we go on to phase 3. You go, well, if it's good enough in phase 2, why do you need phase 3 where you randomize it against the standard? I'm going to give you an example from colon cancer. When I was young, and that's a long time ago, the only drug we had for colon cancer was 5-FU. And somebody combined 5-FU with interferon, and in the first study, 7 out of every 10 patients had responses. Realize we only got 2 out of 10 with 5-FU alone. So that's spectacular, right? We thought with 70% response rate, it would be beautiful. We treated over 1,000 patients on 5-FU versus 5-FU plus interferon, and there was no difference. The response rate was the same. We sometimes, in phase 2 especially, will choose out the best patients who just out of pure luck happen to respond better than everybody else, and that's what happened with that drug. We actually tested it in about 5,000 patients worldwide before we finally decided the first study was wrong. So the phase 3 randomizes new drug or new drug combination versus old standard. And then we find out if it's truly more effective. So what are the endpoints? What are our goals? I love this picture. So the goals of the studies, our biggest goal is survival. Obviously, we want people to live forever. Well, not really forever. We can't do that. Sorry, granting immortality is beyond us. But we want them to survive the cancer. So our ultimate goal is cure, which means surviving the cancer that everybody survives it. We haven't gotten there yet, but we're still working, okay? And we haven't given up. Disease-free survival, relapse-free survival is preventing cancer that's been cut out from coming back. And progression-free survival is people who haven't had their cancer come back, keeping it from growing, okay? And then response rate is how frequently it shrinks. But we don't count shrinkage until it shrinks more than 30%. We're mean. So whereas I can show a person a CAT scan and see that shrink 20%, and we could be pretty excited that the tumor's shrinking, on the report for the clinical trial, it's still stable disease, okay? In truth, for those of you who have your access to your records, the radiologists are cruel people. What they do is every time the tumor shrinks, it can shrink from this to this, and they'll call it stable. But if it goes from this to this, which you can't see, and grows a millimeter, they'll call it growth. They scare the heck out of you when it might not be. That's why your doctor has to go over the results with you. Radiologists are very pessimistic, I think. So median versus hazard ratio this is the key endpoint for survival, whether we're looking at an average, which is median, or hazard ratio, which compares a line to a line. And this is the one graph I'm going to show you, which you saw earlier from Hope. And this shows both, okay? The hazard ratio is listed as 0.74. The median survival gives you the number of months on average people lived on the study, okay, on average. That doesn't tell you how long an average person's going to live or how long each individual person's going to live. We can't predict that thing. All we can do is look at the overall growth, because if you look, the curves never get down to 0, even for this trial, which had very advanced disease on it. But the hazard ratio compares a line to a line, and it gets more confusing. And in fact, actually, doctors have a tough time with it. But it basically means that with a 0.74, that if on the control arm, which lost on this trial, the person was destined to have passed away, that on the experimental arm, they only had a 74% chance of having passed away. Now, that's not as good as we want. We really want it to be much lower than that, but that's what, that at least was successful, and this is a regimen that we use. So things are changing from what I've just done. It's not as simple as all that. It's gotten more complex over time. I actually have a cat too. So we have moved beyond phase 1, 2, and 3, and now there are other things. Phase 1B, randomized phase 2, other sub-studies. It's gotten very confusing, but the fact is that the basic concepts of phase 1 are still the basic concept: dose escalation, side effects. Basic phase 2 is to get evidence of effectiveness, but it's not definitive. And phase 3 is our definitive study, okay? No matter how you do it. There's also these new things, dose expansion cohorts and basket trials, where we take a regimen and we're going to test it in some patients with stomach cancer, some patients with lung cancer, some patients with breast cancer, and each one's its own sub-study, but they're all in one study. It saves the company effort. They can open up the same study at UNC and Duke and Wake Forest and Vanderbilt, and we can put people on all 4 of them without them having to open up 12 studies at all the sites. And because of regulatory costs and other things, it does save costs. The average phase 3 study costs in the area of $20 to $25 million. So that's why they're looking for ways to make it easier. And also it saves time. We're faster at doing these studies than we are at doing the others, okay? Because you don't have to open each study, which takes time. So I mentioned the targeted or biologic agents, the ones that target proteins that are amplified or from mutated genes. These agents block a specific protein that drives the growth of cancers. So they've changed things a lot too, because we might not do the study in, for example, breast cancer or lung cancer or stomach cancer. Trastuzumab or Herceptin blocks that amplified HER2 protein in breast cancer and stomach cancer for sure, and looks like in colon cancer too, but maybe not in all of them. Litructinib, I think I spelled it right, blocks something called NTRK fusion, okay? Don't blame me for the names. Somebody else comes up with them. NTRK fusion happens in 0.5% of all cancers or less, but it works in every cancer that has an NTRK fusion. So it's actually FDA approved, or seeking FDA approval, for treating patients with NTRK fusions, rather than worrying about, is it stomach cancer, is it lung cancer, is it breast cancer? Okay, so just go look for patients with NTRK fusions, because that's all it works for. And vismodegib, on the other hand, blocks the sonic hedgehog, but only blocks it in one type of skin cancer for some reason. It only works against that type of skin cancer, but it's really remarkable in that one type of skin cancer. So therefore, we're now looking at something what we call tumor agnostic trials as well, as confusing as it can be. And patients with stomach cancer can end out on these tumor agnostic trials. The FDA has changed also. With more effective drugs, they're approving more drugs than ever without phase 3 trials. We have so many drugs in development that frankly, what might have made it into clinical trials in the past stay in the laboratory because they're not good enough. So really, where almost everything that gets into the clinic eventually gets into FDA approval. It's really become a much different world, because it's not everything, but so many things get that far. If they get out of the laboratory into the clinic, they have a very high chance of making it. And in the old days with phase 1 trials, there was only about 1 in 25 chance of getting benefit out of the drugs, 1 in 25. But now it's much, much higher chance of response on average if you get into a phase 1 trial. So, and then the rare tumors, which stomach cancer is not, it's sometimes hard to get enough patients to do phase 3 trials, so you have to get creative. So what's the process for getting onto a clinical trial? Well, first, somebody has to identify the trial. Debbie's Dream can help you identify a trial. You just have to contact them. There is an NCI Clinical Trials Finder website, which is not as good as it should be. To be frank, it's usually pretty unhelpful. And when you bring the stack of papers into your doctor's office, he just cries or she just cries, because it's usually about one of them actually pertains to you out of the 70 or 80 that came out. So that's why calling a place like Debbie's Dream can really help you. Of course, your doctor can help you the most. They should be aware of what's going on to some extent. I'm not aware of every stomach cancer trial going on in the country. There's no way I could be. But once you do that, you speak with the study team about the trial, you review and sign a consent form. The consent forms are overly burdensome with regulatory garbage, and I'm sorry about that. They can be 25 pages long, of which 2 pages tell you what you really want to know, but we still have to tell you all that. And then if you sign the consent form, we go through a screening process, making sure labs are right, making sure everything fits so that you fit what are called the eligibility criteria of the trial, and then we start the treatment. Okay, so what are your rights on your trial? Same as your rights everywhere. You've never given up a right to go on a trial. If you're halfway through an infusion of a new drug and you suddenly change your mind about it, you can stop that drug, okay? You have every right you've ever had in your life on a clinical trial, okay? And we just hope that you'll stay on the trial, but we're not going to force you to do anything. Okay, so I'm almost done. I know you're all happy. The one thing that I think everybody needs to know that's getting a lot of publicity in the last several years, and at least one person put up their disclosures. This is a typical disclosure slide from me. Your doctors do things with the companies. In order to get these trials, in order to develop these trials, the companies need to talk to experts. I'm an expert, believe it or not. I know it's shocking when you're sitting here watching me, but I'm an expert, and the companies call me and they want advice, and they pay me for that advice. I get paid more if I show up at my regular job, but they pay me for that advice, and therefore that's disclosed. They also pay for my travel to and from. That's disclosed. It's on a website that's publicly accessible. It's highly inaccurate because no matter how many times I tell them I didn't drink coffee at Starbucks with AstraZeneca, I don't drink Starbucks. They keep insisting that they spent $60 on coffee for me at Starbucks one day. I don't even know where they got $60 worth of coffee from Starbucks. I know it's expensive. And sometimes we're proud of our conflicts. I spoke for Nestle. Darn it, I'm proud of that. But the bottom line is that we do have some conflicts of interest, and it's perceived. It may be real. I think our bigger conflict in the world that's never disclosed or never really talked about is, of course, if we put people on trial, we're going to go on the paper. And for me, academic credit is probably the most important thing. That somebody sees my name on a paper, and where I'm at on the paper can matter. It matters a lot less to me now that I'm a full professor and I've got more titles than I've ever wanted. So I don't really care where my name is on the paper or that I'm on a paper as much anymore. But in my early career, I did. That may have been more of a conflict of interest, but I hope that never influenced any decision. And most of us think it doesn't. But I think you all need to know. And we do disclose it. It's usually written into the consent form. So I hope, in addition to seeing lots of pictures of my dogs, that you see that clinical trials are options, okay? They're options for patients at all stages of disease. People don't feel it's fair. We always take the healthiest patients. So when you're feeling really lousy, you might not be eligible for a clinical trial. I'm sorry about that. I really am. The reason we do that is because drugs work better when you're healthier. And we want to prove whether they work or not in the healthiest patients first before we start bringing them to the less healthy patients. Because otherwise, if we just treated the unhealthy patients, we might miss a drug that really worked for the healthier patients. Doesn't mean they don't have cancer. You can feel great and have cancer. Clinical trials are how we find new and better treatments and less toxic and easier to give, and we learn how to treat the side effects. For a drug called panitumumab, which is approved for colon cancer, I spent 2 days with dermatologists learning how to manage the rash, only because the company was willing to pay those dermatologists to give us advice. And the doctors who were treating the patients on the study took pictures of the rash and went over the rash, and we discussed it. 2 days of discussion, and the treatment for the rash is so good that we're actually preventing it in most patients now. So I think there are benefits to it. So that's it. That was just an extra picture of my dog because I love him. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I don't know if I went over time.
You're right on time. We have time for a few questions.
He took your thunder.
I understand that years ago, at least, the FDA was slower to approve drugs than, say, Europe. And I don't know if it's still that way, and if so, why?
So sometimes drugs are approved first here in the US and sometimes first in Europe these days. And that's partially based on the companies more than anything else, who they submit to first. But generally, we're the fastest these days. Rick Pazder, who's in charge of oncology for the FDA, is actually a tremendous human being and has had a personal motivation to strengthen it and move it forward. I will say that their funding probably isn't enough. Realize that every application for an FDA approval is about 1 million pages long. Not 1,000, not 10,000, about 1 million. And somebody has to read those pages. And so having staff to do it is important. Despite that, we've approved more drugs in the last several years and faster. They actually, once the application is in, they have to make a decision within 6 months. So they are required to answer quickly, and they usually beat that 6-month deadline. They're very impressive.
Does that answer your question?
Well, that was sort of my question. So are you saying, did I understand you just said from the time the phase 3 trial ends in 6 months? No, okay.
It's from the time the application is submitted.
So how can we, as people, shorten that time? Because it still seems to me, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it still seems like it takes forever.
Yes.
Yes, so it is a problem. For example, in a disease called carcinoid, a study called NETTER-1 we reported a couple of years ago, the company submitted and withdrew their application twice to the FDA. So we all thought after their first submission, we had a drop-dead date, as we call it. That means the date that the FDA has to drop the mic and say, we're done. This is our decision. Well, we had a date. It was December of 2 years ago. It got approved January this year because the company kept withdrawing their application. So the biggest thing is the companies. So the big companies are able to do the applications faster in some ways, but the small companies have more motivation because that might be their only drug and the only way they can make money. They're all doing them much faster than they used to, but I think the biggest thing to speed up the process is reducing some of the regulatory burden, which I'm not sure if that's really happening. And that comes from people who don't really make decisions anymore. It's called Congress. They don't make many decisions. Well, yeah, so the problem with the 1 million pages is that exactly what you're expecting out of the FDA. So the FDA has the toughest job in the world, if you ask me. They have to approve drugs that are potentially effective, but they have to be safe. How many times do you hear about something having side effects that weren't predicted? I mean, there are lots of advertisements for James R. Sokolov and other attorneys about that. And they're supposed to prove it, and that safety is what's in those 1 million pages. A lot of it's graphs and tables, and it doesn't take all that long to go through. But, the bottom line is that there's a lot of information in that about the safety of the drugs, and there's a lot involved in writing the package insert. That little package insert you throw away when you open up a pill bottle? Your doctors live off of that. Okay, that tells us how to behave with a drug. It tells me whether or not I can give it if your kidneys aren't working 100%. We live off of that, and all that information is in that FDA application. So much as I think they could probably cut some of that 1 million pages, I'm not sure how many pages they can cut, maybe a few 100,000 of them.
The new thing is the right to try. How is that going to affect clinical trials?
Well, I'm a little nervous about that. There's a lot of things about the right to try, and I think, the idea of the right to try is a wonderful thing. But you got to realize that for me to get an application for person X over there to get a right to try drug is going to take tens of hours. I'm already working 80 to 90 hours every week. I took my first vacation in several years this year, and I don't know when I could find the time to do that work. So I don't think the right to try is going to impact as many people as you think, because we don't know that we have the time to be able to do that work. Nobody's paying for it, and I can't hire more people to do it if nobody's paying for that. It could definitely impact negatively on clinical trials. Having said that, the Right to Try Act really is about drugs that have already gotten through phase 3 and are exactly what she's worried about, the too slow. So it shouldn't affect clinical trials much, because the truth is we've already finished in that disease. However, if Drug X works in lung cancer, and we are hoping it works in stomach cancer, a stomach cancer patient can't come and expect that we're going to do the right to try for them, because we can't. It doesn't apply to that. It applies for that lung cancer patient, and vice versa. So that's my understanding of the law. I've not read the law. Usually they're a nightmare to read if you've ever read one. But the bottom line is that I think it could negatively impact a little bit, but I don't think it'll negatively impact. I think all of us want to get the trials. We would rather see the compassionate use trials expanded. That's where expanded access trials, so we open it up for a whole bunch of people at once. And therefore a whole bunch of our patients can get, rather than one patient at a time, less work per patient, still the same amount of work. But if I could put 10 patients on for the tens of hours of work, that's much more time efficient for what I'm already doing. And it is a problem for all your doctors that their time is getting more and more limited because of the electronic medical record.
Just time for one last question, Dr. Berlin. If you could touch on briefly, when a patient does not qualify for a trial, what are their rights in terms of compassionate use and expanded access?
Well, as far as I understand, then again, there are some expanded access drugs. Sometimes we can get off-label drugs. So you got to realize a lot of the drugs are approved for something and then not for another, okay? And sometimes you can appeal. The companies will allow us to get the drug. If it's a truly experimental drug that's never been approved by the FDA for any disease, we have to put through clinical trials to get it approved for that individual patient. We have to do a lot of regulatory work, and that could take weeks. Most of us have IRBs that are willing to speed that up, but it still takes a lot of work, and finding the time to get that work done isn't always easy. I think almost every one of your doctors wants to do it. It doesn't mean they can do it, but they want to do it. I think there's a limit to how much we can do for that. I'd like to claim otherwise, but generally, if it's not FDA approved or available on, when it's expanded access, they usually let sicker patients on than we're allowed on the clinical trials. So usually you can still qualify there for expanded access. So if it's not towards the expanded access time, the truth is it's not absolutely proven, and there could be harm. I use as an example, we had a breast cancer patient. We were trying a new drug in phase 1 when I was at University of Wisconsin. Breast cancer patient with a very treatable breast cancer. For some reason, heard about our drug trial on Paul Harvey, if you remember that old radio show. And her husband had a lot of connections politically. Congress forced us to give her the drug. She never received standard therapy and died in 6 months because it didn't work. And so there's a downside to going for these experimental things. The average survival was years for patients like her, not months. So I think she cut her life short.